Sneha, can you call Gav?
Yeah, just call them. They're joining in a minute.
Yes. So, are both the teams okay with specs?
Ops good.
I'm sorry, op is good, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. Gav, are you okay with specs?
Yes, okay with me.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Sneha, you can inform them they're okay with specs.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Cool. In the meantime, hi everyone. My name is Vedang Abhich for this round. Congratulations for making this far. With me on the panel are
Hi
Oh,
everyone,
hi.
Krish.
All right, Anshuman, all the best.
Hi, Aryan Coker, no preferred gender pronouns. Good luck for the round.
Hi, Keshav Palek, all the best.
cool then. I guess we are done with intros. PM whenever you're ready.
Hi. Is anyone sharing timer?
Yeah, I'm doing it. Just a second.
Cool. Navakanth, hear him going as Prime Minister. Starting with my speech. 3, 2, 1. Uh, cool. So our case is pretty simple. I think what are we defending, right? We are okay with NATO having some involvement in Black Sea region. What we are like rather opposing is like the involvement being increasing over time. Why is it like necessary, right? I think firstly, very important. I think there's like going to be like economically like hegemonic structures that like NATO countries that are involved here will have over Black Sea, right? What does that exactly look like? Right, NATO involvement here is probably like you going ahead and doing testing or having like multiple like ships and like that and like in like uh and naval vessels out there in like and having a significant presence of it in Black Sea region. So at that point, I think it's like much more easier for you to have access to all the trade routes or like trade channels, or to go ahead and like probably make it much more easier, or it's like maybe probably go ahead and post extra barriers of entries or like exits for like countries that are not involved in NATO, and make it easier for countries that are involved in NATO, like Romania or like or the other countries that are also like surrounding Black Sea and are also like part of NATO, right? I think it's becoming easier for them to go ahead and like have much more access to these trade channels, so they're able to like make more profits out of it, or they're able to have hegemonic control over these. Why is it like necessarily like bad, right? I think firstly, there are like multiple countries who are probably like reliant upon these Black Sea trade routes, right? Just for like exports or like imports. Like European countries need to like probably export a lot of like wheat and rice from like Indian countries or like Asian countries, right? So I think it becomes much more difficult, or they probably have to, or the distribution of these things becomes difficult for those countries. So at that point, I think there's like huge advantage that these like countries who are in like NATO have. So I think then it becomes the idea of like vulnerability. These countries are not necessarily able to like make more profit. But also secondly, I think the major like importance of it is the idea that countries like Russia, right, which the reason why or are probably perceived as a threat. I think they're able to like it becomes difficult for countries which of it becomes difficult for like Russia for going ahead and like having any sort of like access in these trade channels at a point where they're having a crippling economy, or because of the wars that they've fought, and they need to like go ahead and like have access in these trade channels. This sort of like becomes difficult. At that point, they perceive NATO's increasing like involvement here as a threat to their economic structure, and also most importantly, and a second argument, right? I think Russia goes ahead and perceives this as a threat to their own security as well. How does that look like, right? I think when you have so many, when there's like increasing involvement, Russia probably perceives this or feels threatened by the presence of like NATO, and they probably go ahead and try to do some kind of like action, right? Which means they probably see this as a start of war, because if they are okay with probably them or like NATO having involvement, or they're being vessels for just self-defense, right? At a point when because the idea is this: Russia never invaded a country which was part of NATO. It invaded Ukraine because it was going to be part of NATO, because it perceived that it would be much more difficult to go ahead and like have any sort of like control over Ukraine later on in life, right? Later on when it becomes a part of NATO. I think that's where. So at a point where these countries are also going ahead and having an access, and Russia knows that it probably can become vulnerable to these NATO countries if they are given this sort of chance. I think that's why probably Russia also tries to go ahead and create like similar amount of barrier, or like probably go ahead and like probably try to give their, or probably just concretize, or just concentrate all the defense forces that they have to the Black Sea channel, or probably like get them all together in like Black Sea channel, so that they are able to have some sort of resource. What does that look like? I think there's an increased tension here. So at that point, who are the people who are going to be affected by it? To a larger extent, the people who are going to be affected are the ones of like countries in like Russia, or are the people in Russia, right? They won't be able to, because all their resources are being going towards this sort of like defense idea, or for like self-defense. So there's not much that is happening on like public welfare. Also, secondly, the idea of like economically crippling, and the amount of like toll or economic toll that it takes, that a war takes, right? So they are not able to, the people in the country are facing inflation, and they are not able to have any sort of like benefit overall. Crucially then, I think tensions are increasing, and also there's like hegemonic structures that these countries have. At that point, I think the alternative is better, right? Where you don't have like huger involvement, or at least Black Sea region is much more accessible. Sure, you still have territorial disputes, but I think like existence of United Nations, or like countries which are necessarily like, or international bodies or any sort of like agreement that are trying to go ahead and come up for this sort of like for any of these territorial disputes, people or like countries would probably go ahead and pay some attention to it. When there is like increased like involvement of NATO, I think that's where most countries would probably resent the idea. They feel that they have already lost this sort of like war, and that's where there's sort of like these countries would not even involve. I think this resentment is crucial because what does that look like? Russia feels that they are being resentful, or Russia feels that there is like huge threat that is looming. That's why they probably try to go ahead and have newer allies, and they probably try to go ahead and like instigate all the like power that you have, right? Probably going ahead and making allies with like China or like other countries who are also like going ahead and who feel that they won't be able to have any sort of like access. I think that point these tensions increase to a larger extent, or countries would probably would there would be a sense of like because no one is able to like trust the other side, or they feel that there might be any threat that can come on their own country or their own sovereignty. They probably try to make more actions. They probably rely more upon like nuclear testing, or probably to have like more defensive forces overall. But before moving on, POI.
Russia is already part of the region. They have invaded Ukraine. They involved in themselves in elections of most of the Black Sea region countries. What is the delta on your side? Putin is already there.
Uh, cool. So the problem is this, right? You won't go ahead and create any sort of like more trouble, or like probably start the counter offensive when you don't see a threat that is existing. If NATO is having this sort of like increasing involvement, you feel that there's a need for you to go ahead and defend yourself, or probably do something. And also, right, I think to a larger extent, when you have this sort of like increasing involvement, that's when probably any sort of like movement through these like through like Black Sea region might be perceived as NATO as well, to be some extent of like of something that can be attacking NATO, or something that is like offensive in and of itself. I think these sort of like misunderstandings or any of like misattacks can be perceived or can be the reasons for like any of these increasing tensions. At that point, right, I think Russia is like much more going ahead and like is incentivized to take any further action on even the smallest misstep or which can happen in like Black Sea region. So how exactly does that like hamper every actors are involved, right? I think at the end of the day, it's like war that is going to take place, or like it's the people who are going to pay the toll for all of it, right? If any of this tension happens, it's the people who won't be able to get like basic resources, or they won't be able to have access to like just like, food overall. So at that point, in order to like, I think when you have like increasing tensions overall, you have to minimize the amount of like threat that can happen. So that needs to be like lesser involvement of NATO in that region. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. Hello, whenever you're ready.
Hello, give me like 2 minutes. All right. Hello everyone. Name's Archit Lahiri. Prefer pronouns he, him. POI through chat. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1, go. Actually, wait. Stop. The timer. I forgot the timer. Now I begin in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, I want to clear out multiple things. First of all, they talk about an increased influence of NATO in the region. Notice the context slide says in the past few months, probably the amount of influence NATO has been trying to exert over the region has increased. Notice this increase is the status quo, and that is what they have to oppose, which means that we're not defending a world where NATO is going to continuously increase well into the future for no reason at all. We think a world we have to defend is where NATO takes more interest in the region right now, and they probably scale up or scale down based on the way their adversaries in the region, like Russia and China, scale up and scale down. This means if Russia and China have 100 soldiers in the Baltic nations, USA will send 200 to oppose each 100 of China. Doesn't mean the USA going to send 600, 800 soldiers with like 5 nukes behind them because they want to supposedly increase involvement in the region. They just want to sort of involve themselves to to ability that makes it advantageous for them to do so. Notice what is the importance of this region, right? First of all, territorial disputes, military tensions, geopolitical rivalries are things that the government talks about which are bad already exist as per the motion slide, right? Important. This means they already have a very marginal delta in this debate. But notice these countries themselves have a lack of resources, low GDP, they have low extraction of the resources, low scope for growth, but also they have a lack of military strength. This is either manpower or advanced weaponry. They don't simply have the R&D or resources to do these kinds of things, right? Considering these things, they still do have a strong geographical and economic choke point because the movement of agriculture all goes through these regions, which means you have a region of conflict. You have weak countries there who can't control this conflict, and you have good resources or good incentives to want to control control this region, which means in this debate, if NATO is not going to do it, other countries are going to do it. Who are these countries? Panel, Russia and China. But before we get into Russia and China, I just really want to call out on their arguments about, oh, Russia will go to war with the US. I think Russia's not going to go to war with the US, even though that's threatened, because A, Russia already has drained incredibly high amounts of military resources in Ukraine. They cannot afford a war with the US. That's not something they will do. B, Russia is already cannot afford a war because simply they spent too much already on this war with the US. C, Russia already has involved themselves in lots of conflicts, and they don't want to be a conflict with the US because probably the US is stronger. But also notice Putin wants to preserve himself. He doesn't want to get into situations which are harmful for himself, so he won't aggravate the US more than required. And Russia has already attacked Ukraine because Ukraine was not supported by US at this point. If another nation is supported by the US, there's no saying as to whether Russia will actually attack them or not. More likely not, because of what I told you. But what does this actually mean is Russia is not going to attack a country equally as powerful than them because they don't have the power and strength to do so. They will only attack and influence a country that they have an asymmetrically high power over. Notice this goes into my next characterization about how Russia and China are going to exert a lot of influence over this region, right? They want to get a lot of control over the region because of the geographical and economical choke point I already told you, right? This can either look like invasion, like Russia has already invaded Ukraine, but also can look like interfering in elections, right? How China already does in lots of countries. They use sleeper cells, they can hack people's called things, they can they can spread propaganda that they already do. They have backroom corporate dealings and so corruption, and this can also work in terms of just illegal control of like natural resources and just sending troops there. This is basically like sort of nautical miles and just having Russian ships enters the sea space of other countries and therefore control them despite not legally owning them. This is easy ways they can exert influence because these smaller countries don't have a way to stop them from doing so, right? Which means these people in these countries, they keep losing control over the resources and the regions which they already have a lack of. Russia and China dictate the terms of what they can do in these geographical, economical choke points, and they dictate them in a way that benefits only themselves. Notice the harm they talked about with the US hegemony in those regions and US benefiting for themselves applies to Russia and China doing it if they're unopposed to that region, considering they're somewhat aligned also and they're willing to cooperate if it means economic rewards for both parties involved. But see, notice Russian oligarchs exert an asymmetric control and pressure because simply the countries do so, and because of their business nature, because of the control over the people, employees, and the economy of this region, it's very difficult to oppose these things. What do we need at this point then? We need NATO to act as a factor that can oppose these things in three ways. A, in terms of national security, right? In terms of like examples being like countries like Romania and Bulgaria, they don't have the capabilities to defend themselves. What if Russia sends ships into the nautical miles? What are they going to do? They can't send ships back because they don't have ships that are capable of doing that. The US can, which means that if they align with the NATO in that sense, in that particular situation, if they opt into it, then they're going to be able to better defend themselves because they don't have the ability to do so. But this can also apply in other ways with them sending sleeper cells or US defending their country's internet and other ways like that. Or just simple intelligence also works in many ways to sort of use the abilities of NATO and the US to work off Russia and China. And notice, panel, this applies both ways. In regards, if the US is going to act in hegemonic structures and hegemonic ways, then they can use China and Russia's resources to play against them. Notice the balance in the region, but I'll talk about that a little later. Secondly, with NATO's involvement, you have better balance of economics because it's bad for the global economy if Russia and China are going to control these chokeholds, right? Because they're going to increase tariffs for things that they don't support. They're going to have preference selections in what kind of resources they want to go where and what will be allowed through this particular sea routes and things like that. But there's a decreased speed of traffic because of increased checking and increased vetting of these kinds of places because they necessarily will want to harass sea workers in those regions because they necessarily control them and only want to support their own class. They take bribes, they take corruption, it becomes a mess. This is what happened when the Houthis controlled the Black Sea and became a very big mess, right? Which means that economics of this region become better when the US get involved and their powers these smaller countries have, which they can play along and use against each other. But finally, all of this works on the idea of the balance of power, right? And this is simple game theory. If you have asymmetric powers of balance, then the greater powers are going to inflict their wills upon you. And that is something you cannot oppose. But when you have multiple and opposed powers, you can play them off each other. If US is antagonizing you, you can support Russia and China. This is against US interests in those regions, so they will not oppose you. So vice versa, if Russia and China try to antagonize you, you can play the US off of them and use US resources off of them. What this basically does is it gives countries three main things. A, it gives them options. No POIs. It gives them options, which means that they can choose which actors is going to support them most likely and then use those benefits for themselves. But B, the next thing it does, it gives them more freedom in terms of the ability to defend themselves. As in, if one actor decides to unilaterally enforce aggression, then another actor is going to unpromptedly defend because they don't want this particular actor to lose to the other great power, which basically means that it's natural deterrence for all of these countries against engaging in these conflicts. But see, in terms of the violence and conflicts that already exist, which is their best case, if they say, oh, more soldiers means more fight, but that is not necessarily true because I've already explained why there's not going to be formal wars, and because of the disincentive of mutually assured destruction, because they have equal and opposite amount of power, they're capable of destroying themselves. If there was asymmetric power, then they would have, which is government side. Russia and China are going to continue abusing these countries on side government, but they will not be able to because you get increased involvement in the past few years as per the emotion side on our side of the house. And for those reasons, we increase the balancing factor of this region and we decrease the amount of war and we increase the stability hence. For those reasons, you have to vote for side opposition.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. DPM whenever you're ready.
Hi, am I clearly audible? We'll just take like 30 seconds to start.
Yep, you're audible.
All right, Aditya, hear him going as Deputy Prime Minister. POI is via chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Their case is to present this increased force by NATO as an act of self-defense against Russia's aggression. Four reasons why, in the absence of this increased presence, Russia would not have been the first country to aggravate or like the situation in Black Sea. The first reason is exactly like is the constitution of NATO, and LO concedes to this in the very first minute when they tell you that Russia cannot rationally cannot go ahead and start an invasion or or like aggravate any member country of within NATO simply because of the fact that NATO constitution says that if any country is invaded or violated, then every country is obligated. Then it's the obligation of every other country within NATO to go ahead and come in the defense of that country. Which means even if some Romania and Bulgaria are weak countries according to their characterization, being a member of NATO gives them this unique gift or gives them the unique defensive mechanism to go ahead and bring the force of the entire NATO countries, which also includes United States, in their defense. Which means the likelihood of Russia taking the first step to go ahead and violate the sovereignty of this country is extremely, extremely low. But secondly, Russia has just not even yet come out of a long 5 to 6 years war with Ukraine. Notice the time period of this debate. This debate happens in the last 1 or 2 years, which means NATO took this action at a point in time. Russia was already like very, very vulnerable, but also Russia had large amount of committed resources in the Russia Ukraine war, which means at that point it is unclear what kind of threat that did Russia possessed, or Russia like what kind of threat did Russia propose to this rest of the NATO country that they had the need and urgency to go ahead and increase their military presence in the Black Sea region. They had the burden to defend this. The third reason why Russia is not a valid threat right now is that their just like notice their speech. Their make of Russia and China interfering is things like BRI, things like sleeper cells, things like I don't know, like tampering in elections of these countries. It's unclear why having more navies, ships, and more tanks in Black Sea region solves any of these issues. There's a huge problem solution mismatch at op. Now they will say it acts as a double deterrence because mutually assured destruction. Unclear. Why? Because according to them, if someone slaps you and you slap them back, it solves everything. Both people are happy and both people won't fight together. Unfortunately, that's not how world works and IR works as well. Because if you are going ahead and Russia and China are able to like interfere in elections of other countries, are able to probably improve influence other countries because of through economic means, through BRI and shit like that, because of two crucial reasons. A, they have some sort of domestic and political domestic support within these countries. Why is this true? Because large number of these Eastern European countries had their ancient roots in USSR, which means there is some sort of domestic extreme separatist parties which happened in Ukraine, which is also there in Romania and Bulgaria, which goes ahead and support these things. It's unclear why these support goes away on their side of the house, but rather Russia has now a casus belli, and this is a simple term which says that every country in international under international law needs a cause of war to go ahead and take aggressive militaristic actions on their side of the house, unless they prove that NATO had legitimate casus belli or cause of war to go ahead and have increased show of force, and through increased military presence they cannot win this debate. I have already framed you above why Russia was in a vulnerable situation and could not and cannot be a legitimate threat to NATO at all at any point in time. But on the comparative, now if you don't go ahead and oppose it, and they had this clarification that we are only supporting the right now situation. No, that's not how debate works. Problem is the increased force happened due to some factors. Unless you prove that these factors have significantly changed right now, and therefore there is no incentive of NATO to go ahead and further increase, the comparative which you then have to defend is that these factors continue, and therefore the NATO continues to go ahead and aggressively take more and more steps in this particular region. But even if you don't buy this, just buy the intuition pump that if everything which they said is true, and Russia cannot create backlash or Russia cannot escalate this conflict in this region, then it gives more incentives to NATO and US to increase its military presence in the next coming years, simply because this Black Sea region, according to context slide, has huge amount of resources in terms of energy, in terms of has it plays a huge strategic role in terms of controlling the trade which happens in this region. I'll come to the trade and why it's more important in a minute, but just understand its intuition that they have to defend a world where NATO and US, if everything which they said is true, does not face any Russian and China aggravation, which means you get complete monopoly and control under this under the NATO and USA. Why is this bad? It's bad for multiple accounts. Monopoly is bad because of obvious reasons. A, you go ahead and give the complete control of the trade which happens in Black Sea region in the hands of few countries. Who are these countries likely to be? These are not going to be the poor countries which they want to take care of. These are likely to be countries like United States and Western European countries like Germany, France, and Britain. Why is it bad? Because these countries have anyway higher bargaining and negotiating power over their Eastern European counterparts, which means now these countries will force the Eastern European counterparts to go ahead and have a negative balance of trade with these particular countries, in terms of US now replacing Russian oil in the European market, but also US going ahead and taking away the agricultural products which these Eastern European markets completely heavily depend on at cheaper cost. US going ahead and losing ground in European countries, in Eastern European countries to a significant extent POI.
US gets their
Project.
agriculture. Okay.
Go ahead.
US gets their Eastern European produce and this helps them in agriculture and supply chains. Why the fuck will USA fuck over Eastern European countries?
No, US does not get this completely and at monopolistic tendencies right now, because Eastern Europe has a large market in terms of Asia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia right now, because Black Sea routes are completely free and therefore are having trade continues. It's on the comparative. You have to understand that on your side of the house, the regulation of trade happens according to US and Western European powers. On our side, because there is no increased military presence, and again, they have to take this trade off that increased military presence hinders trade, because if I am a businessman, why will I ship my or transport my produce through an area where NATO people are just going ahead and gunning whoever is inside, or there is so much instability, or there is so much threat of Russia counter aggression coming at all points in time. This increases the risk of trade, which means companies probably pull out of this region in the first place, which means trade hampers. On the comparative, there is more long-term sustainability because both Russia has a huge market in Europe to sell its oil, and Europe, Eastern European countries in particular, has a huge market in Asia to sell their agricultural produce. This codependency ensures the everything which Archit talks about, which is mutually assured destruction, things like that. Which means on our side, incentives remain to have a stable environment. On their side, you break this balance of power because you show increased aggression without any legitimate need. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. DLO whenever you're ready.
Just checking if I'm loud and audible.
Yes, you are.
Thanks so much. I'll just start in a few seconds. Viewers exclusively through the chat. Please don't unmute. Uh, I'll start in three, two, one. To exert influence, Russia doesn't need to attack these countries. Their premise is that if you're a NATO country, Russia would not attack you. That's true. Russia doesn't need to attack them. What they essentially can do, however, is they go very close to their nautical mines and block their trade routes. What they can essentially do, however, is to say that USA and NATO would not ever support you, and that's why you should elect far-right governments and essentially make only deals with Russia, only deals with Vladimir Putin, and oligarchs get an entry point towards these Eastern European countries around the Red Sea region. These are all of the things Russia can do, and we know this because Russia has been doing this for last 10 years. Notice how Turkey's Erdogan is necessarily close to Putin. The reason of this is really simple because USA and NATO have looked as unreliable actors and unreliable allies to these countries for the longest period of time, and it's the right time to fix it. Because Aditya is right that monopolies are bad, but the monopoly currently which holds right now is a Russian monopoly. Because look, NATO and USA have not come to support of the Eastern European countries because of their roots through USSR, and that's exactly why they're completely close to Russia. Why is this bad for the citizens of these Eastern European countries and the Red Sea countries and so on? Because they don't have an active choice of whom they want to ally with, at a point at which US and NATO necessarily look weak actors and weak allies on their regard, which means that they have to choose only Russia, and that's the only option they have because there is no other way to compete against it. Why is this necessarily bad? For multitudes of reasons. The first thing I want to talk about is why this is necessarily bad for countries in their regard, and secondly, why the lesser domination of Russia is just good on our side. Why is this bad for countries? The first thing I want to talk about here is that Russia is already here right now for three specific reasons. One, you necessarily get close to Western Europe of countries like Germany and France, which necessarily allows you to put pressure on these economies and so on. This necessarily is true. The reason why Russia is invading Ukraine right now because this gives them access point to Europe via Poland and Germany. This means that they want to get closer and closer. Secondly, the resources and the trade routes they want to talk about, Russia controls them to this day, and that is why you see monopolistic deals happening between Russian oligarchs and these Eastern European countries, which are government subsidized. The reason why this happens is because Russia controls the region throughout it because of the USSR roots Aditya necessarily points out, and the negligence of USA and NATO to prioritize these regions in the first place. This is important because these countries have no other option rather than to trust Putin and whatever he does, which means that Russian military ships already exist in these regions. But thirdly and more importantly, the geographical location is great, which means that there is more amount of resources. What does this essentially prove to you? The threat is already there. This is happening for last 20 years. This is factually true. You can necessarily check your Google. They're bullshitting their case to different speeches. What does all of this prove to you then? That the timing is currently right. It is true that Russia is weak, and that's exactly why USA and NATO should intervene and increase their own military presence. Because Russia can't counteract this military presence in the first place because Russia neither has the resources or money to do so, and there's a prioritization issue. They either can prioritize Ukraine or prioritize the Black Sea region. They'll probably prioritize Ukraine over how invested they're in that region right now, which allows an access point right now. Because currently for last 6 to 8 months, this country have been negligent from Putin because Putin's priority is precisely only focused on Ukraine right now. This allows US and NATO to gain some trust back, and thus allows them to form relations with this country and to enter these regions in the first place. Why is this analysis crucial? This proves to you a few things. One, if you have to gain the trust of these countries, you can also not fuck over them by monopolizing their markets. Because if you do, they go back to Russia, and that's harmful for NATO itself because it allows Russia to get closer and closer to Europe and USA. You don't want that because you saw what happened in Ukraine. Because when immigrants were entering Poland, you are fuck scared of what Russia is doing right now with Belarus. You don't want that to repeat, and that is why you want to give them a fair deal in the first place. But secondly, if you don't give them a fair deal, they just fuck off to Russia in the first place. But thirdly and more importantly, there is interdependency between these actors. You can't monopolize this market because Germany and France are dependent upon supply chains coming from Eastern Europe and Red Sea region. If you monopolize this market and don't allow trade to occur, you can necessarily fuck over these supply chains in the first place. But fifthly and more importantly, you also would not monopolize this market because the supply chains or the trade which is going from Eastern Europe to Asia is also important to the West because Asia is their manufacturing hub. So if Asia doesn't have access to raw materials coming from Eastern Europe, American power plants and units which exist in China, Vietnam, and India also don't get resources from Eastern Europe. All of those reasons means that the interconnectedness of the supply chain doesn't allow them to monopolize this market in the first place. What does, however, is allows two competing nations competing for the same supply routes and supply chains and control over it. This is good for the countries. Why? because you can choose your ally, which is to say you can pit USA against Russia and ask for a better deal. Because you don't give a better deal, we'll fuck off to the other. This is good for this country because this allows them to control their own resources, their own money, and their own trade routes. This is good for these countries because their economy is far better off if there are two balances of power. Currently, Russia is monopolizing this market with their own ships. You create active deterrence by allowing NATO ships to be there. Before I move on to
POI.
the second comparative, POI, yeah, what's up?
Yes, you are highly inconsistent because according to you, on our side, these countries have no bargaining power and therefore are under Russian control. But on your side, suddenly, in a NATO-controlled Black Sea, they have bargaining power to pit US
Yes,
against Russia and get
yes,
the
they
best deal.
do. Yeah, got it. They do because there are two countries competing for the allyship of these countries. If you don't have options of allyship, you only have Russia. In our world, you have Russia and NATO. That's why you have bargaining chip. Because if NATO wants your allyship, they have to give you a fair deal. If Russia wants this, they have to give you a fairer deal. That allows you to put these countries pit against each other. That's why you get a bargaining chip. That's why you get a fair deal. Because if you have only one actor giving you a deal, that would never be fair because of the power asymmetry we want to talk about. Secondly, lesser domination of Russia is just great for this fucking world. Why? Russia doesn't have regards for any sort of rights. Which is to say, if Russia continues to dominate and oligarchs gets to be very close to these leaders, you mean that you have external funding, which means that you have more and more far-right governments popping up in Eastern Europe, which has already happened. You necessarily have to stop this. Secondly, Putin just doesn't know when to stop, right? Which is to say, Putin is extremely erratic and necessarily has the narrative of greater Russia and wants to make USSR days back. This means making Eastern Europe countries join Russia again. That can take any sort of measure. The invasion happened because Zelensky didn't want to ally with Russia. You don't know what Putin will do next. All of those reasons means because the supply chain gets affected, because Russia gets to control this region, prices goes up, supply chains are disrupted. In our world, that doesn't happen because it's bullshit that increased military presence necessarily increases the amount of pressure in the supply chains. No, Suez Canal is one of the most militarized places in the world, but every singular trade happens via it. Why? Because it's safe. It's safe because there is deterrence. We get this deterrence only in our side at a point at which NATO is able to deter Russia rather than Russia to go scot-free. Could not be more proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. Gov Web whenever you're ready.
30 seconds. Okay, I, Tanya, going as government. We prefer mode of POI after the fifth minute to raise of hand. I will start my speech on the self count of three, two, one. Firstly, Russia's military buildup is primarily defensive in nature. That is to say, if NATO's encroachment increases, then they will go ahead and ensure that their own security is not threatened, and then go ahead and create violence in this region. That is to say, what opposition tries to very beautifully mask as balance of power is increased conflict and tension in the region. But understand that Russia has multiple reasons of why will it not go ahead and create military violence in the region. Firstly, a simple clarification, that is to say, in the motion itself it is written that we have to oppose an increased NATO involvement. That is to say, bare minimum amount of military that is there for self-defense of NATO against threats by Russia still exists. But we, on government side, opposes this additional increase in involvement unnecessarily in the Black Sea region. Understand that Russia already is deterred by economic sanctions from the West. That is to say, Russian economy has already significantly been affected by the war, and there are lesser reasons for it for to now go ahead and be aggressive, and that is why they are not going to be compelled to increase their military in this region if NATO doesn't go ahead and do so. But understand there are domestic concerns which are, that is to say, only self defense measures are taken by Russia at this point in time, because there is this internal domestic pressure within Russia because of how there is economic instability because of frequent sanctions from the West. That is to say, they will prioritize stability and rebuilding their economy over going ahead with this military adventure on our side of the house. But even invasion of Ukraine and Russia can largely be understood as a national security concern because of increasing Western influence and NATO's eastward expansion. And that is why you create this kind of conflict on your side of the house. But you bring China into the debate. Understand that China is focused more on Indo-Pacific regions, and they're more invested in South China Sea and broader Pacific regions in general. That is to say, even historically, China has little or no say in Black Sea region in the first place. And that is why it is not balance of power but increasing tension and conflict. This harm is irreversible. Every person killed in this kind of issue, the principal harm on your side. But understand, people in Eastern Europe now hate NATO and West even more. That is to say, what they want on the Eastern European incentives are to have peace so that they can continue trade because they care about profits. And that is why they are likely to now take side of Russia on your side when NATO is actively going ahead and increasing its military activities in these regions. And that is why when in these countries overall there are tendencies and values of how Eurocentric or Westernization is bad, you're giving more and more incentive to the world to hate NATO and these powers in the first place. But understand, why is conflict increasing? Because it is directly a show of force done by NATO, and it is not done it in its self-defense tendencies. The harm is simple. Merchants are more skeptic on your side, and there are more chances of conflict and war. That is to say, Russia will now go ahead and have more and more incentives to go ahead and increase its military power, which will create a cycle of action and counter action on your side of the house, which will which will raise the risk of conflicts, but create this escalatory cycle on your side, because now Russia has this active concern of NATO encroachment. But understand that areas with high military presence, even if at your best case there is a balance of power which you claim, in that case also trade activities will significantly reduce, and at the world at large it is bad, because when these kind of trade routes are disrupted because of military, goods in and of itself become more expensive, which means you need to defend all of this of good becoming expensive. But it leads to a reduction in trade activities because of an increase in violence. That is to say, now when merchant feels there is a more chance of loss, there is this uncertainty, investor confidence reduces. But understand, risk increases for businesses. That is to say, they have to like bear these kind of insurance costs, etc. And that is why when there are more and more chances to damage of infrastructure and uncertainty, the companies will be hesitant to use this route in the first place, and that is why you significantly reduce the relevance of the region because it is known for its trade. But environmentally also understand that this region is very nutrient rich, and it has it is nutrient rich and extremely important for like local ecosystem of the region. And that is why it's important to regulate the climate and weather of the region. And that is why it is also bad in and of itself to go ahead and do these kind of military practices, because it's morally wrong to like harm these kind of natural resources in the first place. But before I move on, POI.
Stop the lies. Every singular trade route which is on water is militarized to protect the merchants in the first place. Increased military presence gives them more deterrence and more security.
Increase in military presence does not give more deterrence, especially on your side when this military does not exist for self-defense in and of itself. Read the motion again. This house opposes an increase in NATO's involvement. That is to say, a decent amount of military or security exists on our side of the house, which is making sure that the trade is balanced and proper on our side. What harm is on your side is this military presence being firstly continuously increased, but also because this military presence will now be from both the parties, be it Russia or be it NATO or the West, as you talk about. And that is why when you are increasing this kind of military on your side, trade is at a harm. And basic amount of security which ensures that trade is facilitated, or merchants or investor feels confident or secure at all points in time, largely exists anyway on our side of the house. Military presence, just because it, like gut check this argument, military presence in any region gives a signal to investors in all regions of the world that the area is prone to conflicts. That is to say, even if at your best case it's a balance of power as you talk about, it is not, because military presence in any area, be it like missiles or any kind of other military activities, they actively cause harm. And that is why when Russia right now has no kind of active incentives to go ahead in these regions, because they already are constrained and restrained by their domestic internal policies, and how they are already like extreme amounts of economic sanctions on them. It is more likely that Russia will not go ahead and build up or create problems in this region, but it increases and escalated on your side when you go ahead and increase NATO's involvement in the Black Sea region. But it also is bad for the environment in of itself, because again, this is extremely important. This water here is nutrient rich, and there are like commercial fisheries, etc. It regulates the climate, and that is why when any country go ahead and create this kind of harm in these carbon sinking regions of the world, it is in and of itself problematic in nature, because it's environmentally also wrong to do so. With that, proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. Up web whenever you're ready.
Yeah, just give me a minute. Hopefully, I'm clearly audible.
Yes, you are.
POI is only through the chat. Please do not unmute anytime between the speech. I'll definitely try taking one. Please don't unmute.
Just a little thing. Can you come close to the mic?
Is it better now?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Yeah. POIs, like I said, I repeat again, only through the chat. Please do not unmute at any time. That being said, I'll start my speech on a countdown of 3, 2, 1. The context side reads, the way this NATO increases its intervention or involvement is through military exercises, strategy plans, and increased patrolling. They don't run nuclear tests or nuclear tests of missiles that harms the nutrients and water around them. I think that's an absolutely absurd claim that comes from government. You're not damaging the environment, you're just using more submarines or whatever to just patrol the area. Right? A second claim that I get is goods become expensive because people have to spend more in trade routes. How? I don't get any mechanism through it. People still have to go through these trade routes in the first place. I don't know why prices increase as a whole suddenly. Second thing, military practices that exist in these trade routes scare people who want to trade over here. The comparative on Gov is the military intervention that already exists on these trade routes are nautical miles that are controlled by Russia, as that comes from my second speaker as well as the first speaker. The already presence of Russia on these trade routes and Russia's involvement in these trade routes is already proof of existing military presence. People still trade over it because it's that much important. You cannot give me 7 minutes plus of analysis as to why this trade route is so important and suddenly tell me that if it's some other country that also comes to help military intervention, these trade routes completely become irrelevant. Then moving on to the pathway to victory, I think it's very simple to do how we win this debate, right? It's easy. The countries who need an important active need for deterrence, who need an important and immediate solution for their economy, have to be benefited. And the way they benefit them is by providing them some sort of binary to say that NATO's involvement is more than enough to tip the scale in their favor or more than enough to give them a better quality of how they lead their life or lead their country. Here's what it comes, right? In terms of what Russia's involvement is, the mech I get from Gov is simple to the fact that Russia is very defensive. Russia won't get into wars until it feels provoked. Russia doesn't want to get into wars because it's already got into a war with Ukraine. Russia doesn't want to get into wars because Russia has a very unstable internal political climate or political system and hierarchy. Two things. Russia still got into war when Ukraine and all of the world was against it. Russia got a large amount of followers. It still wanted control over the trade routes and want to get closer to Europe because it benefits Russia in the first place. But on the flip end, if you're going to tell me after the involvement of Russia with Ukraine, it's gotten a large amount of sanctions and needs more economy to flow in the country, the way it's going to do this is getting more control of the trade routes so they can go ahead and balance it out to benefit themselves in the first place. So entire mech I get from you is to just go ahead and tell you Russia still does have an active need to go ahead and control these enemy lines, go ahead and control these trade routes because two reasons. They still want to go ahead and get these sanctions out of the way and clear them because they want money in the first place. We go ahead and give you better analysis than mech. The likelihood of me going and proving to you the reason that Russia wants power is so that they can keep on influencing these trade routes in the first place makes more logical sense because they've been doing this for a large amount of time. They want resources. They want access to the most popular trade route. They want access to these countries because when they get access to these countries, they grow closer to European countries such as Germany and France. They grow closer to Europe and US and they can then establish themselves as a power. I think the characteristic analysis that we come is more likely in nature as to what Russia's beliefs and intents and purposes with dealing with these trade routes are in the first place. Second thing, how does NATO's involvement then go ahead and affect it? In terms of likelihood of benefiting these countries, NATO acts as an active deterrence against war or involvement from Russia. Deterrence act works only when both the people acting in this position have equal amounts of power. The countries without NATO's involvement have an asymmetric power balance to Russia. We've already mechanized this to multiple degrees that the reason Russia has control is because Russia has a huge oil market. They naturally have larger resources than all these countries. These countries cannot potentially match these Russian resources. The only way they can do it is when NATO has an increased way of going in and helping them in the first place, so increased involvement. This means you have two active powers who are equally balanced in power, meaning that there is some sort of deterrence against war because both sides will lose out effectively. The second thing, we provide you enough mech on how the likelihood for NATO to go ahead and fuck its own self is less likely to happen. Because NATO still heavily relies on these countries because any trade routes that these countries have to do, they still have to support NATO. Because the flip on that is, if NATO doesn't ally with these countries have all the rights to go ahead and do it in Russia because Russia has already placed a strong holding on them. Manasija gives you enough points as to how they'll increase far-right governments. It's something Russia can do. So these countries don't want to ally with NATO. They'll go ahead and ally with Russia in the first place. NATO doesn't want that because NATO doesn't want these Asian countries to produce good in the first place. Manasija gives you enough of this. But then second thing, I'll take a PI later. Moving on, I think the propensity of war. We go ahead and tell you why war is not possible because you have two equal powers that's going to deter war in the first place. There's going to be some sort of peace. These people have balance and able to opt into who they want to go ahead and side with. They're able to opt into because these people now see NATO as an equally powerful person that can go ahead and help them because NATO is just that much more involved. They actively see that NATO is doing something that can actually challenge Russia and they're not scared of Russia in the first place, meaning Russia doesn't have control. If you have lesser dominance of Russia, these people are able to then pick out balance. So in simple metrics of where these people are more opt-in or where the scale of opt-in is more and the scale of having a choice of decision of who you want to ally with is more, you have because you have equal amount of goods and importance that are coming from both sides. You have NATO that's giving you enough reasons to ally with them, as well as you have Russia that's giving you enough reasons to ally with them in case you want to. The second thing then, stability of these regions. If I'm able to prove to you why Russia is a bad actor, because Russia has really shit policies, they treat people very bad ways, and the way you mitigate this by bringing someone as NATO as equal power to go and challenge this is how we do it. Meaning stability is achieved simply because you have NATO can go and offer you the stability. NATO can have multiple military exercises that can go and prove your country that yes, there's an actor who can help you. They're doing enough resources to help you. They're taking enough actions to help you. Meaning this is someone I can trust. I can go away from Russia in the first place. The power within these countries do not fall into existing actors which Russia has already controlled with pre-existing USR allegations or alliances like you told me. But then the next thing, in more things of characterization, I'll take a POI.
If Russia is as bad an actor as you posit and it has the necessary capacity even after Russia-Ukraine war, then why will Russia also not retaliate to NATO's increased force and increase its military presence and conflict?
Amazing. This is why you do not throw two speeches out of mech on deterrence out of the window. First thing, Russia won't enter a war when the person against them has equal amount of resources to challenge them. The only time a person can have equal amount of resources to challenge Russia, especially in such countries, is when they have NATO support, at least NATO's increased support. What is the counter model then? When NATO doesn't have that much of presence in these countries do not come out do not have enough resources to challenge Russia in the first place. Russia naturally has greater resources than them. Russia may have come out of a war from Ukraine. The amount of resources they still have is much more than the resources these countries have without NATO. They won't have equal deterrence when NATO is not with them. Hence why deterrence is so important to prevent war in the first place or prevent any sort of involvement from Russia. It's simple. On a simple basis of where you can stop war and prevent the propensity of war, we talk over this debate. Because the MEC we provide you is enough to prove the incentives of Russia to go ahead and control these countries. We go ahead and tell you why NATO also have incentives to not fuck up these countries. We go ahead and tell you why NATO are not fucking up these countries, will give these countries balance and freedom of choice in order to pick who they want. Simple metrics of the principle of me having a choice as a country to choose who my ally is. Simple on where I can opt into my better lifestyle, better trade routes. Third thing, a simple policy in where I can deter a bad situation and deter the fact that Russia has become a superpower and I don't want it to control my country is why we take it over in this debate. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for the fine speech. Stop reply whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Am I audible? Loud and clear.
Yep, you are.
Thanks so much. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. They have two claims. One, trade gets fucked. Two, escalation happens. Firstly, on the idea of escalation happens, this is marred with so many assumptions that you don't think you can. Even if we don't debate on our side, they still lose this because of lack of analysis. Because note, their analysis of escalation is that NATO does something. It is present there. Russia gets alerted. Russia attacks back. The problem is this, that there is faulty analysis from the get-go because Russia is already present in those regions. Why? Because of the importance things they have talked about. The DPM clearly says that there is a huge Russian presence here because of the Eastern European ties they have with USSR. This is absolutely true. I agree. Secondly, Russia has been there because NATO has not get themselves involved in countries like Bulgaria, Romania, and so on. These countries have been deprioritized. Thirdly, the importance of this region, which is highlighted by both PM and LO in this debate, means that Russia also knows this importance. Putin is not fucking stupid, means that he necessarily controls these regions in the first place. Russia is already present, and that's an issue because there's nothing deterring Russia right now. Romania on its own, Turkey on its own cannot deter a fucking huge Russian army. You need NATO for it. What does NATO do? NATO is currently doing military exercises. You know what a military exercise is? It's like you take out a ship from Romania, you take out a military ship from NATO. Both these military ships take a scroll around the seas of Romania and they come back. I'm not really sure why that is bad for the environment. I'm not really sure how this necessarily fucks up the trade which they want to talk about. I'm also not really sure how it attacks Russia in the first place. Why all of this is important? Because if NATO makes its presence clear that we are able to protect Romania as a own, it's the only thing which deters Russia. There is no escalation. Escalation is already happening. The escalation led to a war in Ukraine. NATO doesn't want that to happen again. I'm sure countries around Ukraine in the same region also don't want to get invaded. That's why this is important. Secondly, on the trade, I want to do this based on an intuition pump. The reason why Houthis were able to block a trade route on its own on the Red Sea, and this led to huge amount of problems in the supply chain itself, shows the importance of security in these regions. It's much more secure when NATO naval ships are roaming around for you to trade because it gives you a sense of security. If there are terrorist organizations as characterized in the context slide in this slide, means that they can literally take over the ships in the first place. I'm pretty sure it gets harder when there are NATO naval ships roaming around to do this. If anything, we make trade much more secure for merchants, and this allows their held. This is analysis coming from the second speech itself, which goes rather unengaged throughout the benches. Lastly, what is the metric of this debate? How do we win on it? Firstly, the metric on why it is better for countries in the Black Sea region. We tell you this deterrence itself allows for lesser interference of Russia, and that's good for a multitude of reasons. The first thing is that it finally gives a choice to these countries. What is this choice we are talking about here? This choice is rather simple. Like, where USA and NATO were not involved in your day-to-day affairs, they didn't want to be your friends, and now they do. They're getting you a better offer. This is good for countries for two specific reasons. One, you get a deal from USA, you get support from these kind of countries. That's just good. Two, if they actually are giving you a deal, you ask Russia for a better deal, and Russia gives you another better deal. So even if they're aligned with Russia, that's okay because at least they have a better deal now rather than one person just giving the deal and lowballing them. That's good for these countries. Second thing, and this is really crucial, which Tarun, me, and Archit have talked about from the get go, and there is no engagement on this, is that why lesser domination of Russia on a global scale and their lesser control is just a net utility good for everyone around us. Why? Because they fund fight right governments, because they necessarily cut down on all levels of taxation, because they necessarily ensure they're intervening with elections, because they necessarily do not have any regard for human rights, because you don't know when Putin will decide to fuck you up. All those things mean that you need security against this, which only and only NATO can provide you. No engagement on this. We win this clash from the get go. Kunami, we're proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for the fine speech. I call upon government reply. Here.
Hi, huh. Clearly audible?
Yes.
Cool, Aditya going as go reply. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, you are a farmer in Romania. I am very shit at IR, so I'll just use Manasija's mic to explain to you what is the situation right there. According to him, you are a farmer in Romania, and your produce right now, you want to sell it to, like, you are forced to sell it to apparently Russia or apparently to East Asia, because Russia dominates this trade. The implication of this is that you are not getting any help, and the way Russia dominates this trade, according to them, is by tampering your elections, therefore creating your policies for you, or by probably like just having your oligarchs influencing your businesses and corporations. And the solution which Manasija gives is a NATO ship comes, a Romanian ship comes, and they have a round in the Black Sea. It's unclear how this solves the problem A, but it is also unclear how this helps you as a farmer of Romania. What's rather going to happen is that Russia is continuing to it continue to have its presence, whatever it is, and therefore continue to exploit you regardless. But rather, now you are more actively against Western Europe and like US sentiments because, well, you just stopped the trade route through which you were getting whatever little amount of money you as a Romanian farmer was earning through the Russian trade. The trade is blocked, and that is why you are poorer and in a worse of situation than when the motion started, where this active military presence was not there. But the second question which they had to answer is, why is this the only solution to the problem which they identify? The problem is true. Okay, Russia had a presence. We even mitigate the problem. We tell you, and they concede to it, that Russia is weak and vulnerable at the point at which this solution was enacted. Because Russia-Ukraine war just happened, and Russia-Ukraine cannot be the parallel in this debate, because Ukraine was out of NATO. Other countries are inside NATO. So regardless of how much they harp on about Russia's increased presence in Eastern European countries, it cannot be to the extent that the sovereignty of political and economic and military sovereignty of these countries is threatened, because that's just illegal according to NATO constitution. If any country sovereignty is threatened, then every country in the NATO, including United States, has the right and obligation to militarily defend that country, which means if Romania, Bulgaria are saying, hey, help me, we are being exploited by Russia, then it is unclear why NATO is not helping them and has already invaded Russia or has already created some sort of military presence in Russia on our side as well. Which means the kind of problem which they identify is untrue, but also is not that important to generate this particular action of increased military presence. But even if you buy that the solution is warranted, why is this the best solution? Because presumably, US and Eastern Europe, like Western Europe, wants the resources from Russia. And this comes in Manasija's speech, that there are MNCs controlled by US in Asia. You want them to have raw material, so you want these resources. Okay, then just go into Eastern European countries, tell them that, hey, this is our offer, please sell your goods to us and not to Russia. I don't know why you can't have this competition without this increased military presence on their side of the house. How increased military presence solves the problem of the presence of Russia in these eastern countries? These are problems which they identify but they never solve. Our case is extremely simple. If everything which they say about Russia is true, Russia identifies that Black Sea is a very, very important territory and we can't let it go. Right now, on our side, when present in military presence is not there, Russia can just continue being a docile and being a silent spectator and not violating the sovereignty of NATO countries, because then there will be immense backlash. So stability continues because both the sides want trade. On their side, because of increased military presence, Russia is desperate and Russia acts out. The mechanism for this you will find in Manasija's and Tarun's speech. You don't need me to explain it. Which means increased conflict, blocking of trade routes, people dying because they are not able to live their lives, and controlled monopoly by US market. US using Eastern Europe to fund its MNCs is not a good thing. It's also part of the monopoly. You are deciding where the goods are sold. We don't think it's true. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech. We come to the end of this debate. Cross hands and leave the meet for the judges. In the
Thank you.
meantime, Yup. In the meantime, judges, you can DM me via Discord or WhatsApp your verdict. You can take your time, of course.